The corporations problem from February of 2001 is yet another fact pattern that easily could have found a home in my remedies seminar. This is a question that requires us to show keen insight into essay technique and good organization. But beyond that, this is another pretty simple question. And the people that failed in their answers to this question typically failed before they wrote one word in the Blue Book. Take a look at the call of this very short and thus scary fact pattern. What personal and or derivative claims can Pat reasonably assert against Selco, Adam, Betty, and or Evan, and is he likely to succeed on each claim? Discuss. Well, this fact pattern is really asking 8 short answer questions. We need to have a separate section for each of these defendants, Selco, Adam, Betty, and Evan, and within each one we will have one section on derivative claims and another section on personal claims. That is a very simple way to organize your answer to this fact pattern. And amazingly, many candidates didn't do it, and as a result, we're at a tremendous handicap. So let's make it easy. We're going to organize it in the intuitively plain, simple way that the examiners obviously want us to organize it, and then we're going to find a home for all of the facts, reaching legal conclusions that make sense and that show an understanding of the law. So look at paragraph 1. We meet Adam. Adam is our second defendant. He owns 100% of Selco, a corporation that sells houses. The board of directors consists of Adam and Betty, and those are our second and third defendants. In paragraph 2, we see that Selco owns 90% of the stock of Buildco, another corporation. Pat, our plaintiff, owns the other 10% of Buildco stock. Buildco's business is home construction. Buildco's board of directors consists of Adam, Betty, and Evan. Evan is our fourth defendant. Betty is president of Buildco and is a salaried employee in that capacity. Neither Adam nor Evan are an officer or an employee of Buildco. In paragraph 3, we've got key facts. Adam urged Buildco's other directors, Betty and Evan, to approve an arrangement whereby Buildco would build houses and sell them to Selco at cost. Selco, in turn, would sell the homes for a profit. Based solely on Adam's representation that the arrangement makes sense, Buildco board unanimously approved this deal. Buildco thereafter continued to construct homes exclusively and selling them to Buildco. Buildco sold them at cost to Selco, and then Selco sold the houses for a considerable profit. Well, there's only one thing wrong with this deal, and that is that Pat, as a 10% shareholder of Buildco, is going to be forever denied any profits. And that's why Pat is coming to court, and that's why Pat is going to win. Let's move on. In paragraph 4, we notice, no surprise, Pat objects to this arrangement because it derives Buildco of the only source of money to pay dividends. And then we get the call of the question again. So, here, again, as is almost always the case with these short fact patterns, we need to find a home for every detail, and we need to be able to explain precisely and succinctly exactly what is going on. And we have to reach clear conclusions. So, please turn the page and have a look at the outline of issues that I have presented. And you'll see that I do go into a little bit more depth in the outline than our little scratch outline that we could create just in response to the call of the question. I did flesh out this outline somewhat. But please notice up front that the basic format of this outline is identical to the one that we were able to think of before we even read the fact pattern. And applying that technique, taking everything you can get from the call of the question, is invaluable. If for no other reason than that it gives you a lot more time than you would have otherwise. So let's look at this outline of issues briefly. First, Pat versus Selco. The personal action that Pat is seeking would involve either compelling a dividend or dissolving Buildco. Now, these two elements of her personal action are ones that they didn't give us directly. We have to figure them out. But certainly it is obvious that Pat's personal claim will basically center around the fact that he's not getting paid dividends, and he should be. Next, we consider a derivative action brought by Pat on behalf of Buildco. Here, Selco has breached its duties as a majority shareholder of Buildco, and we focus on remedies, rescission, reformation, and damages. And then we reach a conclusion. Next, we consider Pat's action against Adam. The personal action involved piercing the corporate veil. The derivative action involves litigating breaches of the duty of loyalty and the duty of care. And then we reach a conclusion. The analysis of Pat versus Betty is a little bit more complicated because with regard to the personal action, we will focus on Betty's possible breaches of her corporate duties, and then we will also focus on fraud. And the reason why it is very useful to bring fraud into the equation here is a remedies issue. By bringing in fraud, a successful plaintiff can pursue punitive damages in addition to compensatory damages. Next, with regard to Pat's action against Betty, we consider a derivative action, and here the analysis will track the analysis of Pat versus Adam, in that we will focus on Betty's breaches of the duty of loyalty and the duty of care, if any, before we reach a conclusion. Then, finally, we focus on Pat's last lawsuit against Evan. Here, he will seek to pierce the corporate veil, and also we'll focus on the derivative action in the same format as we have before, the duty of loyalty and the duty of care, before we reach a conclusion. So, here, let me pause for just a moment before we review the answer, and here again, let me re-emphasize just how important remedies are. Because in order to create a really thoughtful answer to this corporation's problem, we've got to think carefully about what the plaintiff would be seeking, both personally and derivatively. And it is that thinking that makes the difference between an answer that is, say, a 65 or a 70, and an answer that is a 75 or better. Now, please turn to my answer, and let's review it with a little care. This is another answer that I think serves as something of a showcase for analysis. Look at Pat versus Selco. Up front, I lead with the relevant facts about who owns what and what the companies are doing. Then I focus on Pat's personal efforts to compel Buildco to pay a dividend. Here I lead with the facts again, and I think with a fair amount of insight. I indicate up front that the Buildco-Selco deal has been very successful for Selco, and I indicate the problems that this causes Pat. Then, in the second paragraph, under 1A1, compelling a dividend, I focus on Selco's fiduciary duty to Pat as a minority shareholder. So, the Selco-Buildco relationship denies dividends to Pat, and it might even damage the value of the other 10% of the stock that Pat holds. So, I discuss below Pat's strong personal claims against the other defendants. Certainly, although dividends may not be compelled, Pat is going to get compensated in full as a result of this lawsuit. Next, we focus on Pat's arguments that Buildco should be dissolved, and here Pat has a strong argument. Buildco's basically turned into a shell company for Selco. And again, I indicate that although Pat reasonably could ask for dissolution, this is a situation that could be better compensated and better resolved for all concerned with damages. Then we focus on the derivative action on behalf of Buildco, and here, again, notice how I work in a little bit of law. Pat's not going to be required to first make a demand on the board because that would be futile. And I tie in a couple of the key facts. Then, in the second paragraph of my analysis on the derivative action on behalf of Buildco, I focus on Selco's breaches as the majority shareholder of Buildco. And I go through the analysis in a fair amount of depth. My ultimate conclusion is it's probably better to reform the agreement than to scrap it altogether. But in my conclusion, I indicate that Selco has breached its fiduciary duties to Buildco. the most efficient remedy would be to require Selco to buy out Pat's interest, including a reasonable return on his investment, and then to carry on with the Selco-BuildCo agreement as before. The agreement is profitable. It works for everybody concerned except Pat. And once we fix the situation as regards Pat, then everybody else can go on to do business and make money. Next, we focus on the lawsuit between Pat and Adam. Here again, I lead with the facts. Adam is a 100% shareholder of Selco, which in turn owns 90% of BuildCo, with Pat being the remaining 10% shareholder. Pat wants to pierce the corporate veil and sue Adam personally, as well as derivatively. Fair enough. Let's focus first on the personal action. Here, we focus on Adam's breaches of corporate duties. And here, I lead with the central fact up front. Adam's company is profiting at the expense of Pat. Then I incorporate by reference the earlier analysis about how this deal profits Selco only and BuildCo gets nothing. So here, the same facts that would justify awarding damages from Selco to Pat also support a compensatory damages award against Adam. A majority shareholder owes fiduciary duties, and Adam has acted in bad faith. Next, I focus on fraud, a tort theory of liability that, if awarded, would justify punitive damages. Here, I indicate, for once, the law up front. Pat is alleging fraud. Pat has to show a misrepresentation, reliance, and damages. Here, the misrepresentation was Adam's presentation to the board that the deal made sense from the perspective of BuildCo. It certainly does not make sense. It hurts BuildCo at the profit of everybody else except Pat. So the bottom line here is Pat is likely to be able to prevail on the fraud claim and, as such, would be entitled to compensatory and punitive damages from Adam personally. Next, we focus on Pat's derivative action on behalf of BuildCo against Adam. And here, we focus on the allegations of breach of corporate duty. First, we focus on the duty of loyalty. I establish that Adam controls 90% of BuildCo's stock through Selco, and a majority shareholder is not allowed to put his personal interests ahead of those of the minority shareholders. And also to the company that he owes a duty of loyalty to. So Adam has been unjustly enriched at BuildCo's expense, and that means that a restitutionary order is called for. So notice we have focused on damages and restitution and the equitable remedy of reformation, all in the context of a corporation's answer. So once again, I tell you, remedies is the most important subject on any bar examination, especially the California bar. So next we focus on the duty of care. Here, Adam's deliberate breaches of the duty of loyalty also add up to a breach of the duty of care. So I conclude that Pat is basically going to have a field day against Adam. All of his claims, as far as I can tell, are viable, and Pat should win compensatory and punitive damages for fraud. And Pat's claim that Adam violated his duties as majority shareholder of BuildCo also are good, and he will win both for himself and derivatively on behalf of BuildCo. Next, and finally, we turn to Pat versus Betty. Betty is a director of Selco. She's both president and a director of BuildCo, and Pat has personal and derivative actions against Betty. First, the personal action. Here, Pat's claims against Betty are the same as his claims against Adam. Betty stands to profit, although she is not a named shareholder, but as Adam's wife, she's got a community interest in any profits that Adam makes. Yes, this question really does have a tiny crossover question issue from community property, and it's very much in your interest to see it and to recognize once again that the Committee of Bar Examiners rarely tests a subject in a complete vacuum. There are little crossover elements in many essay questions, and this is one of them. Pat gets to pierce the corporate veil and proceed against Betty personally. Plus, Betty also may face punitive damages for fraud because she had to know that Adam's false representation to the BuildCo board that the arrangement made sense was false. She remained silent when she had a duty to speak, and she personally profited. Next, we focus on the derivative action, and here again, Pat's derivative claims against Betty on behalf of BuildCo are identical to those alleged against Adam. She's president, she's on the board of directors, she owes duties of loyalty and care, and she breached them. So she's going to have to make restitution to BuildCo to prevent her own unjust enrichment. So I conclude that Pat's claims against Betty are going to succeed. She's liable to Pat personally for compensatory and punitive damages for fraud, and she's going to have to disgorge her profits. Then, last but not least, we focus on Pat's claims against Evan. Evan is on the BuildCo board of directors. He voted to approve the deal, and so Pat sues Evan personally and derivatively. The personal action involves piercing the corporate veil. Here, the difference is Evan didn't profit personally from the relationship between BuildCo and Selco. He didn't knowingly participate in any wrongdoing. So we're not going to allow Pat to pierce the corporate veil and pursue personal claims against Evan. However, it's a different story with regard to the derivative action. Here, Evan owes duties of loyalty and care, just like all the other directors. He had to know that approving this transaction would render BuildCo unprofitable forever. He had a duty to inquire further and not merely rely on Adam's fraudulent representation that the agreement made sense. So, I conclude that Adam's derivative action against Evan, Pat's derivative action will succeed. Evan breached the duty of care, and he faces liability for compensatory damages. But Adam has no personal claims against Evan. And that wraps up a consideration of a corporations fact pattern that really has a lot more in common with civil remedies questions that we get in torts and contracts than your run-of-the-mill corporations fact pattern. Once again, we see just how important it is to organize carefully and to be mindful of remedies.